Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It's a pleasure now to welcome our afternoon panel. We, George Mason, have been working with young professionals in infrastructure for, I think, 5 or 6 years now. With this afternoon panel, they bring in a new and different set of fresh faces to talk about issues and new and fresh issues. And so we're really delighted to have this working relationship with them. This year, Jack Schwab of WSP has been our point of contact with YPI and has organized a great panel to examine, how the P3 industry is responding to the challenges and opportunities arising from AI and from the changing federal landscape. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jack and the team. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all for coming. So as Jonathan said, my name is Jack Schwab. I'm the Vice President of Education for YPI. Young Professionals in Infrastructure is an industry-focused nonprofit organization that was founded in 2015 by young professionals active in the United States infrastructure space. We focus on increasing knowledge transfer, building relationships between young professionals, driving increased inclusion in the infrastructure industry, and promoting awareness of alternative delivery methods. I actually do a lot of my work with the Virginia Department of Transportation, but on the asset management side, and I'm a part-time Annapolis resident, so I spend a lot of time down here in the area, but I'm based out of New York. And I'm going to give some short introductions for our 3 panelists. Jodie Misiak on my left is a Senior Vice President and Service Lead in WSP's Project Development Management Consultancy practice, where she specializes in assessment and implementation of appropriate procurement, project delivery, and program management strategies for state and local governments. Before joining WSP, Jodie served as USDOT's Senior Advisor for the Build America initiatives, where she advised leadership on innovative finance and P3 policies, capacity building tools for state and local governments, and strategies for advancing complex multimodal projects more efficiently through federal processes, and as Director of MDOT's Office of Innovative Project Delivery. And you heard from a current person in that office moderating our earlier panel. She represented the department's P3 program priorities and policy objectives on the leadership teams for the Purple Line Light Rail Transit, DBFOM P3, and the I-95 Travel Plazas, DBFOM P3. And as was said earlier, the Purple Line does have a lot of stories on it, and she's one of the authorities. Kathryn Roos is a principal strategic consultant for HDR Inc. Kathryn has more than 15 years of experience with complex programmatic efforts to help government and private transportation clients develop and implement new programs and sophisticated project solutions that advance their agency's vision and achieve performance goals. She's nationally recognized as a public-private partnership expert, having led the 2-time award-winning DC Smart Street Lighting Project. She most recently served as the Deputy Chief Operations Officer for the District of Columbia Department of Transportation, and prior to that, she served as Chief of Staff for former Transportation Pete Buttigieg when he was Mayor of South Bend, Indiana. And Kathryn serves with me as a co-president of I serve under Kathryn, who is a co-president of Young Professionals in Infrastructure. And the third member of our panel is Dan Sweeney, who is a transformation leader at Accenture on the Global Cities Transportation and Infrastructure team. Dan's focus is on advocating for safety, sustainability, and resiliency across critical public infrastructure. Daniel's work includes helping clients understand and prepare for the digital future of critical infrastructure, as well as leading in the development of multimodal applications for digital technology and strategy in the transportation industry. He served as a fellow with the World Economic Forum, leading their Building Tomorrow's Urban Infrastructure Task Force, and he previously served as a project engineer and a planning engineer in both the public and private sector. So I'm very happy to have our 3 panelists today to talk about how the private sector is thinking about the current moment in public-private partnerships with everything that's on the horizon. And so with that, I can stop reading things. And go to my actual questions, which are, to start with, we're a little over 100 days into the new presidential term, and we have these we have budget reconciliation on the horizon, transportation reauthorization on the horizon, and we're in a bit of a political whirlwind at the moment in terms of all the news out there. And of course, being in the infrastructure sector, we're talking about projects that have timelines of decades rather than and we're in a couple of unclear months for projects that'll last decades. So thinking about it from that perspective, how do you think about advising clients on projects in times of this kind of policy uncertainty? And I'd like Kathryn to start us off.
Sure. So we're really seeing clients want to have access to as many tools in the toolbox as possible. So we're seeing clients that maybe have P3 enabling legislation, but haven't really contemplated using it for certain projects. Maybe they've only used it for highways, and now they need to start exploring it for other potential transportation and infrastructure projects in general. So we're starting to talk to clients. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty. I think we're still in a moment of paralysis because they don't want to overcommit themselves to too many things because they don't know what's going to happen 3, 6, 9 months from now, let alone years down the road. So we're trying to help clients think through how do you plan for the short, the medium, and the long term, and looking and evaluating what are your capital needs. What are the tools that you have in your toolbox? If there's some that you haven't used before, educating them on tools like P3 or other forms of alternative delivery, and setting them up so that when they are in a position to make decisions about, okay, we need to start to execute or start the planning process or the construction process for certain projects, they've got a plan going forward. So we're really in capital planning mode with them, trying to align their needs with their resources and the tools that they have to execute those projects.
Daniel?
Good afternoon. On a rainy day, and I love that that's been just a really mindful approach to all this. I think we've had a little bit of a kind of a duality on our end. We've had we need to learn, and then we need to help teach. So we've done a lot internally on the learning process by starting to leverage a lot of our tools that can do quick scrapes for constant updates because there's a million a day. And how can we catalog that? How can we basically turn that into something that's useful in a learning process? We're also really doing a lot with our partnering groups, right? So we've got a lot of organizations that we partner with, a lot of different people that have a lot of ways of viewing this, from the strict policy side to the how's this going to impact supply chain, all the way to just a general, do we like it or do we not like it? And so we do a lot of work bringing all that in to teach and kind of understand it ourselves. And then we're finding ways to hone it in hyper specific to whatever our client is really concerned with. So we'll take a top 1, top 2 priority and say, okay, you need to know exactly what this tariff is going to do to your supply chain for this part of the project. Bam, we will get you that information as quickly as we can. And I think that's where we're trying to take a really, really direct approach with just going hyper in the now, utilizing our tools as much as possible, and then teaching in the best way that we can. But just like you said, it's really quick turnarounds. It's really hard to give them anything that's going to be this all-encompassing knowledge base. But it's just as much about learning ourselves and applying the tools that we have, and then helping teach them in whatever way is going to be most valuable. But it's a learning process still. Every day, every week is figuring out what's going to be best in any given scenario and based on what the need is with them. So it's a learning process heavily, and I think a lot of people are seeing that, but we're trying to use our tools as well balanced as possible without over leveraging, but really making sure it's extremely pointed for what our client might need.
I'd agree with both of these overviews. I think we are very well prepared for this because most of our projects are over 10, 20, 30 years in development. We have very long-lived initiatives that, by their very nature, are going to encounter various roadblocks and challenges over time. So our advice to our clients tends to change. We've seen 15, 20 years of ups and downs for the projects that we've been working on. We anticipate that there will be ups and downs for the various projects that we're looking for the future. And it's really just thinking about, the range of possible outcomes, developing mitigation strategies for risks that we think will be developing over that time frame, and making sure that we have the long view in mind. for the infrastructure development. And I think, it's hard in a moment where you are, bombarded with information every day to be thinking like that, but the nature of our projects hasn't changed. It takes a long time to procure, a long time to develop, and then over time, if you have long-term operations and maintenance, then it's very much maintaining that perspective for our projects and knowing that everything we do and everything we think about to make our projects more resilient will help pay off over that time period.
And on the other morning panel, which was about technology, AI has kind of taken over and begun to dominate the software discussion. Certainly with any kind of public agency you're working with, they're always interested in how they can get ahead on the technology curve, even though, by their nature, it's a heavy investment to make physical infrastructure assets smart. And so thinking about that as kind of technology increasingly moves in as a theme, what technology developments in AI or otherwise are you excited about, and how necessarily are you thinking about AI as a factor in your practice? And I think, Jodie, you can start us off on this one.
I think to date we've been keeping our eyes open for ways in which AI and other technologies can help solve for the challenges that our clients are facing. Because ultimately, incorporating technologies into the processes and procedures that our clients do day to day that are not helping them to move the ball forward is just going to be distracting. So we've been keeping our eyes open, our ears open. To date, we haven't necessarily incorporated as much into, at least and from our perspective, the procurement processes for our clients. Keeping that in mind, technology in general, and I think if we take a broader view of technology, the past 5 years, technology has really changed the way in which we deliver our projects. And primarily, again, from the perspective of the work that I've been focusing on for procurements, 5-10 years ago, we didn't have as much opportunity to collaborate across geographies, or at least there wasn't as much sort of an openness to collaborate across geographies on projects. Folks tended to have to come together for meetings, and it tended to be maybe a slower process in general with the logistics. I think technology, by the necessity of what's been happening over the past 5 years, the technologies of being able to meet virtually, the technologies of being able to run procurements virtually, technology of collaborating on documents in new and kind of ways that people hadn't really been as open to previously, I think makes what we're doing much more efficient, much stronger, and I think we can be more thoughtful because we're not distracted as much by the various logistical elements, which I think, even though it's not AI, I think a more basic kind of technological approach to our procurements, I think has changed substantially. So if we can see more tools like that help make our processes more efficient, collaboration more seamless, then those are definitely the things that I think our clients will be interested in.
Yeah, I think building on what Jodie said, we are seeing it less from clients of wanting to incorporate it in their day-to-day. I think they're, kind of still getting used to using things like SharePoint and Teams all the time. And DOTs aren't always the quickest adopters of technology. So we're not seeing that request. But one thing that I am excited and hopeful to see is developers on the development side of when they're putting in proposals. I would love to see ATCs that are leveraging technology or forms of AI to provide better quality services, a higher enhanced level of service, or provide savings to particular projects. And I think that's probably where there's a lot of room for growth in the use of AI and other forms of technology, particularly when you're talking about P3s, is on the developer side, because that's part of, the inherent nature of choosing a P3 is that you're wanting to leverage the innovation that the private sector can bring to you that isn't always inherent in a state organization or a DOT. So that's where I'd love, excuse me, to start to see some more ATCs for those kind of concepts that can be evaluated.
Can you clarify what that acronym is, ATC?
Alternative technical concepts. So it's part of, excuse me, part of the P3 bidding process that allows a developer to come back and say, yes, we know that this is what you want, but here's a slightly different way that we can provide it to you that we'd like for you to consider. And this is a very typical process that's used throughout P3 procurements. And has very specific ways that they get evaluated and assessed, and then it's ultimately up to the client whether they want to leverage that and choose to move forward with a particular ATC.
Great. And Dan, if you want to take us up.
Jack knows I get paid by the AI, so this is like perfect for me. No, it's not. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately. There's definitely a host of technologies that we have seen both in these pilots and trial phases, and then that we've seen actually get adopted and actually be utilized. One of our biggest focuses now, especially, is what is actually going to bring you value when we talk about anything that's in general AI, agentic AI, generative AI, anything in that space, and then how are you actually going to use it today, tomorrow, and in your long-term future. Most of those conversations either go towards one or two places. It's either planning or it's operations. That's usually how we start to separate them out when it comes to something like one of the technologies that we're really looking into more and more, that we're seeing become more common, which is having a digital twin. Now, that definition can become so broad that it gets lost in a lot of wash, but essentially, we've seen a version of it from what's my current state, whether that's your current asset management, whether that's your current operational system, and how can I get that in a digital representation? So how can I take that data and make sure I can see that, whether that's real time, whether that's represented in a mapping system, whatever that looks like, or if you're starting from the very early sense of a program, a capital project, whatever it is, how do I build out that from the very start? And then how does that help me all the way through my life cycle? And life cycle really, really showcases the value of something like a digital twin very early on, because you can get scenario planning. You can start to look at population changes on your project. You can start to look at what type of development's going to go on around this project and not just the project itself. And we can start to bring in weather and climate patterns to have resiliency models that go into this. That helps your scheduling, that helps your budgeting, that helps your understanding of what you're dealing with and how you can adjust across the life cycle of a project. Or, I mean, you can go all the way to the city level, a regional level. That's a lot to ask for right now with it. But looking at scenario planning and understanding where it's going is a massive, massive advantage for anyone. And that's bringing everyone to the table. That's having, especially in a P3 sense, you know who's going to own, operate, and run the whole thing here. Why not have a lot of that built in at the very front end on the digital side so that throughout this process, you're able to make the changes you need to. You're able to run X amount of scenarios based on things, especially in the landscape we have now, where you can start to build that in right now and you don't have to wait for something to be done. You have your as-built already digitally transferred and you can start to look at how you're going to do your proactive maintenance. It's just a really strong advantage if you can, A, if you can build it in and afford it, and B, you create guidelines very early on that says you need to have this type of data to work in this ecosystem. You need to understand what you're doing on this program to come in and be part of this. It gets everyone on the same page, and then it allows you to really be just a strong partner, whether that's internally on your program or externally back to your other stakeholders. It also gives you such great transparency. And I've seen that become a huge theme with a lot of different projects. A lot of different officials want that transparency. This is near immediate transparency on these things, from a financial side, from an optics side, and from a results side, the outcome-based part of that. So it really starts to build up all of these things you already want to have. It helps leverage that. And then honestly, AI is just a little plug here, it's a little flick there. It helps you be a little bit more efficient, but it's not this all-in basis. It's more of what is the value of it? Where can it be applied in the right way that's going to help you out and help your employees out? Not some sort of solution all. It's just, it's not going to be that, and it shouldn't be that, to be quite honest. That's how we approach it.
And on to the next question, which is, so we're thinking about the federal policy landscape, we're thinking about AI, and now trying to think about what's going on in P3s more broadly. If you ask someone off the street what they think of when they think of a public-private partnership, if they're a very informed person, they would still probably tell you toll roads as the kind of classic case for a private concession. And I think transportation is what we think of as the basic P3 question, and all three of you have done significant work in the transportation sector. What are the big themes or trends you see in transportation public-private partnerships that interest you, or things that you're thinking about following, or that you're especially following looking ahead? And so keep the current kind of snake order going. And Daniel, if you can start us out on this question.
Back on the hot mic, yeah. So one of the organizations we work really closely with is ITS America, and they're really leaning into a lot of the trends that are kind of coming out of both the policy runoffs, but then also where the digital side is being pushed and things of that nature. But one of the areas that doesn't get talked about enough probably is workforce, and the impact on workforce and what that looks like, and how to help make sure that there's a much more positive feeling around what's going on the digital side, as well as what other changes are happening that will enhance and help workforce rather than replace, reduce, and slash. And that goes all the way down to something at the university level and helping them understand that this is not going to all of a sudden turn out to be 25% less jobs in this sector. It's just going to change the type of skill set that you need to work in the sector and in the right ways. And so we did a full skill gap analysis of a 5, 10, and 15-year outlook of what skills would be needed on different types of projects, whether that's a toll road, whether that's a transit project, whether that's any type of large-scale integrated project with a port or an airport. What skill sets will people coming out of college, or will the current/future workforce need? And then how can we start to build that into training? How can we start to build that into collaboration with universities? And that's where it's really cool and amazing to actually do a study, which we got to do, I think it was up at MIT. Same exact group, same exact level of knowledge and same world, no grads versus undergrads. And one group had a very select tools of agentic AI they could use for a program, and the other ones didn't. They only were allowed to use very basic, Word and PowerPoint and everything else. And the results were more collaboration, more ability to work quicker and just more dynamically, and an overall more polished work product based on the timeline. Now, it was the same amount of people. There wasn't a change up of 5 versus 2 or to showcase that you could do it with less people. It was just to show how these tools are just really strong enhancers and really strong at developing these new skill sets, which get to just better products for the same areas of work, and just allow you to advance in that way. So we're really trying to both message it as well as help start to develop what that training looks like, so that it's a really strong throughput from universities to early on training and mentoring to those leaders who are also then bringing that back around. So it's really looking at how to leverage that the right way, and workforce being a positive versus so often it's negatively framed when you talk about technology and the replacement. And we're really trying to put that out there the right way, because communication can never be done enough with something like this.
So we're seeing many of our transportation clients have had experience with previous alternative delivery approaches, or getting comfortable with it, may have responsibility for a wide range of assets. And we're seeing many of them now considering maybe they've done one or two initial transactions, and are thinking, okay, what are the other assets that we have? Maybe some of them are underutilized, some of them are kind of outside of our main area of focus. Can we think about them more from a public-private partnership perspective, and what are potential solutions for these assets that may not necessarily have had like immediate solutions in the past. Those might include parking lots that may not be used as efficiently. Maybe you're thinking about maybe real estate uses, housing uses for those locations. Thinking about rail yards, underutilized rail yards. Could those be reutilized or repurposed in a way that brings greater value both to the agency and the surrounding areas? And just kind of thinking in a creative fashion about the assets, which again, many of these organizations have a large number of diverse assets that they could leverage more efficiently. So we're having many conversations along those lines with clients and thinking through the ways in which the tools that they are familiar with on more traditional projects could be applied to initiatives that may have not necessarily been in their area of focus, a few years ago.
So we're seeing a lot of clients that are more interested in maybe non-traditional clients of universities. We're seeing a lot of universities start to get into P3s and be really interested. Specifically, we're seeing a significant number of university energy plant, either replacements or significant overhauls to really align with university board kind of directives on decarbonization and meeting certain environmental goals and priorities for universities. So this is a space that we're really seeing an increase where, and if you also think about it very similarly to our highway and our transportation infrastructure, which saw a significant increase post-World War II, so did a lot of our universities because of the GI Bill. So they built a lot in the 50s and 60s in response to an influx of students. And now that infrastructure is probably well past its lifetime and needs to be, it's kind of been band-aided. And now they need to look at some bigger upgrades or significant renovations of their facilities. This also extends to university housing. It's another place where we're seeing clients have interest in how do we address, the providing facilities and housing that is to the grade that students want. They're paying for this, and so they need to meet kind of upgraded standards for things. The other place that is interesting on the social infrastructure side, we're also seeing courthouses. There are several courthouses being procured as P3s right now. Again, government infrastructure that has very specific security requirements. It's a complex design and overhaul. Those requirements have changed over time. They're dictated by the DOJ. And we're seeing a lot of jurisdictions come and say, hey, we're really worried that we're going to get a consent decree from the Department of Justice, and we don't want to be in that situation where we are forced into something where we don't have as much control. So, but they also don't have the funding, at least right now. And so they're looking at P3s as a way to address their short-term funding shortfalls, because again, first thing we always tell clients, P3s are not free money. But as a way that maybe their debt capacity opens up in a few years, that they can have certain milestone payments or things where they're paying over time. So that's another space where we're seeing an increase use of P3s right now.
And that gets right into the next question, where we're here today at what was last year the George Mason Center for Transportation Public-Private Partnership Policy. That was in the last year renamed the George Mason Center for Infrastructure Public-Private Partnership Policy to reflect the fact that P3s, that transportation sector is no longer the only thing people should be thinking about when they think about public-private partnerships. So with that as an option, with that in mind, thinking outside of transportation, what are and Kathryn, you already got into some of these, what are the sectors that are exciting, and potentially what are kind of new ideas of delivery methods coming into play as the industry continues to become more and more important to the infrastructure landscape? And Jodie, if you can start us off for this one.
We're very fortunate in WSP to have experts in a wide range of infrastructure areas beyond transportation, and as such, the folks who have the technical expertise in these areas have brought to the alternative delivery team kind of a much broader scope of potential clients to engage with and projects over the past several years, and really leveraging this experience that we've gained on often on transportation projects to advance infrastructure in a wide range of technologies. One area that's particularly interesting and one that our group is very active in is in water. And across a wide range of water infrastructure needs. I've been very interested to hear the increase in projects in certain areas of the country in desalination, and thinking about really solving for some of these critical water access issues, and technologies that I think are really at the cutting edge and leveraging P3 structures over a very long period of time, still in sort of the 20, 30-year time frame, to construct this infrastructure, stand up water purchase agreement strategies with the public sector, so that issues that we're finding increasingly critical in parts of this country and around the world are being addressed in a comprehensive and a long-term fashion. So I think that we'll see more of that certainly as we go forward.
And Daniel, do you want to comment?
So about 3 weeks ago, I was at a panel. It was focused on infrastructure, but it was more focused on the energy side. So the panel had 3 people on it. One person was in the energy generation side, so the actual power plant, factory, energy generation. Secondarily was someone who does energy distribution. And then the third was a little bit more on the end user side, kind of on the public side. And so the public side actually started, and they said, what is your biggest problem right now? What's your biggest issues? And the public side said, we don't see that there's currently enough capacity being driven into our region to handle what's going on with EV generation, with additional grid capacity, everything else that's going on. The person who was doing the distribution said, that's not our problem because we're working with things that are 80 years old and we're not getting enough money funneled in to redo transmission lines and to make sure that we've got the right amount of distribution funding to get where the power is going to get here. And we're also seeing too much influx and up and down from the capacity provider, the actual generation providers. And then third, the generation provider said, you're all doing it wrong. We've got such an overcapacity of power that you're all the problem. And I just sat there and I said, which one do I believe, right? Who's telling the truth here and who's actually, and I think it's always going to be the same, right? It lies somewhere in the middle. Everyone's kind of got their own challenges that they exist with here. And the power supply group biggest gripe was that, of course, they're not maximizing on money because if they're sitting on an excess supply of power, that's a huge problem, right? But there was just this moment that it just seemed very interestingly, the circularity of something like that. And I think so there's 2 parts of it. You're seeing that there's clearly disconnects on communication here. There's clearly issues of making sure that there's a front-to-back understanding of what's available, how it's getting there, and how it's being utilized. But then there's also a ton of potential and opportunity here, especially as we're starting to see a little bit of P3 work into the energy sector and really connect and break down some of these barriers, help a lot more interested parties get investment, get opportunity into where it's coming from, how it's getting there, and how it's being utilized, and translate that into a much more, on one end, it's super profitable, but on the other end, you're then saying, we can grow this city by 100,000 people and we'll be okay. And you can have that trust versus there's so much distrust that exists in the power industry from what I've experienced. And I think P3s offer a much, much stronger level of agreement on that because there's a long-term commitment and there's just so much more that you can do in that ecosystem versus how it's done now with a lot of disparate contracts that don't ever agree with each other and have different terminology, different understanding of what's going to be happening. And so it's slowly happening. I think microgridding is probably a big part of that because you can do it in stronger fashion and you can set these up quicker and with more agility versus some of the really large regional power distributions that kind of cause pause on a P3 mindset. But I'm seeing it grow. I think there's also the idea that there's a massive risk factor that comes with some of these assets because of whether it could be hurricanes in the Southwest, it could be heat issues and just different types of things you're dealing with in the Southwest, or in the Northeast you're dealing with so much snow still that's unpredictable. And I think having technology that can better help you predict at least your resiliency plan. Not necessarily, you're not going to fix everything or prepare for all of it, but if you can have at least a sense of what your resiliency model looks like for that and how you can be better prepared to deal with that and who's going to be impacted and how, it creates a little bit more of an, okay, I can feel better about getting into this massive partnership for a long term if we feel like we have a really good plan in place versus, well, if that power line goes down, I don't know who's helping me, I don't know what's going to happen, but if it falls back on me, then I'm out X amount, 100,000 because we had to fix it. And I think there's definitely more trust to be gained there because we can now leverage technology to do weather prediction models and asset risk evaluation.
Anything extra on the topic, Kathryn?
I guess the only other thing that I'd add specifically about what I'm excited about or what I see significant potential for is really at the intersection of P3s and technology. And I think that that's someplace where there's a lot of opportunity. For example, inductive pavement charging, which is the idea that an electric vehicle can charge as it is driving along a road. This has significant benefits for particularly long haul and medium haul trucking when it comes to environmental benefits and where it makes a lot of sense. Now, there's also a lot of challenges of, long haul trucking is an interstate system. And so how do you get all, states to work together? Because it doesn't just make sense to have one state doing it when you've got to cross a half of the country, a third of the country, et cetera. So I think there are challenges, but this is where I think that the P3 world, both us as advisors, developers, can come together and really show that the P3 model works in bringing innovation to some of our technology challenges as well as to our infrastructure challenges. And I just see a lot of potential with that. I think it's hard in this administration right now, given some of the challenges of policy that we're seeing of that's not an emphasis at the moment. But I still think that down the road, the work that we can doing, as you said, Jodie, these are long projects. They take a lot of pre-planning to occur that I think starting now and using this time to do pre-planning and thinking about, okay, how do we maybe implement this in 5 years or start to put out more beta programs? Because we do see some states right now, Michigan and Florida, for example, are states that are both beta testing inductive pavement charging. And so the more that we can learn from those and then apply those lessons learned across other states and start to think collectively about how we can address some of these challenges, I'm excited about that potential.
And thank you very much. And so those are my pre-planned questions. I have some more percolating, but I'm ready to get some questions from the crowd. If you want to step up to the microphone.
Scenario that Daniel painted here in Virginia, and it builds on what Jodie said about desalination. And I agree with your cautions, Kathryn, about how we're going to finance these things. Let me ask you, is this what you're seeing in data centers for Virginia and the merger of the cross section and how we're going to provide for EV and mass transit and power needs and how we're going to finance that? I'm an advisor on 3 data center projects. My experience, I'm curious to compare notes with this panel, is that the hyperscalers interviewed the utilities 2 years ago. It was a horror story. Exactly what Daniel was saying, but on steroids. Because none of the utilities would provide 99.9% reliability. They won't take that liability. They won't build the generation and and backup systems that you need to do that. So who brought up microgrids? Yeah. So that's where they're going to retreat to. And what I've seen, Kathryn, with this administration is that the hyperscalers will not take coal, but they will take gas. So that seems to be where it's going. I'm curious to compare notes that the big pockets of cash in the data center operators are going to be gas ramping to nuclear SMRs in Virginia and a number of, at least a dozen other states, like Texas, like Michigan. Is that what you're seeing? Because that's the live game that I'm seeing going on right now in Virginia.
Now, have you tried the Microsoft approach of just going and purchasing an entire power plant for yourself and making sure that that's available? Just a
Okay, but Jodie's got a background from UBS.
Mm-hmm.
So when you dig down into it, Microsoft isn't buying TMI.
Right.
Constellation owns it.
Yes.
Microsoft's only going to give them a PPA.
Right.
So there's room here for P3.
There is.
And DOE is going to provide some financing to it. So I think once you get below that headline,
Right.
it gets real interesting.
It does. In that same group that I talked about earlier with the panel, Constellation actually was a part of a different panel and did a lot of discussion around that. And there was some talk about how data centers in the same way are also starting to adjust for that by having an idea behind dynamic data centers, where instead of some of the more traditional backup generators that might be in place, there's actually a dynamic energy use that can be pulled into that to actually accommodate something like a microgrid setup. So take, for instance, somewhere like Texas, where they did a massive haul on their solar, right? And there was a huge push for that there, and there's a lot of money towards it. That's obviously, here or there, but how do they then manage with something that's got a high and a low frequency on some of their energy production and what that looks like? There's definitely been some unique models on basically looking at doing gap fills on when you have those high and lows and how that can then be essentially agreed upon. It's not necessarily a P3 from what I've seen on that, but it's a version of that. Now, the shares of how that's being done and then how that gets sorted out on a week, month, yearly basis, that's been a problem because the agreement on how that's going to work is really tough because you're talking about really dynamic capacity issues. And there's not some sort of, okay, I've got 80% and then you've got 20 and then we'll switch to 30, 60 or something like that. It becomes really dynamic, and that's where there does need to be that trust build. And if you have a long runway, you have a lot better of an option to build out both the hard infrastructure of it and then the soft agreements across there on utilization. But I haven't seen that get all the way to a mature point where I'm saying, yes, that should be everywhere, but it's an option that I'm starting to see and get a feel that could be much more viable, especially with, like you said, hyperscalers wanting to move so light speed fast on this.
I'd say one of the things I'm more familiar with the nuclear side of things and the nuclear regulatory side. So I think one of the things that you saw at the end of last year, there were a couple deals with data centers and bringing back on what had been decommissioned nuclear power plants. And they got shot down. And that was the headline. They got shot down and the authority rejected the first step in the process to go get reaccredited. Yeah. If you actually go and look at the write-up from the board, and it was about the reason that the board denied it was the fact that they hadn't taken into consideration the local community and the distribution of power to them. They basically were saying, hey, we want this, we're gonna provide it, they're gonna eat it all, and they forgot the surrounding community. And this is where, again, a true public-private partnership, they forgot the public part of this. And I think that that's where there's an opportunity, particularly in the data space, that advising to some of our private sector clients, such as Google, Amazon, others, that are trying to build these and are going after and saying, we want to align with nuclear power for long-term stability here, that they also need to engage the public jurisdictions of which they are in and of which get their power around them to be part of that project. And then I think they can get past that hurdle of the Nuclear Regulatory Authority and getting that next step approval. Because certification takes several years. So if they can't figure that out now that they've forgotten a partner and they need to bring someone else to the table, I think that's going to be an uphill battle. But I'm hopeful that they will figure that out because it was very clear in the ruling why they were saying no.
What do you think of putting a nuclear SMR on a military base to deal with some of that?
Well, a lot of our, some of our bases do have nuclear reactors. And I think it's something where the government, I think, is going to move slower than the private sector on it. So I don't know that partnering with the federal government and DOD on it is going to make a faster process. That's my personal opinion. That the regulations that they would have to go through for procurement and other things, you could do it, but. Well, yeah, I mean, the Navy the Navy is the one that owns the vast majority of nuclear reactors in the world, because every single one of our aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines in the world, or in the United States Navy, are powered by nuclear power. So they are the biggest owners, but they also regulate themselves. So you'd have to figure out a new structure for that. So from a policy perspective and a functionality perspective, I'm not sure about it. Okay.
They've covered it.
Perfect. Are there any other questions in the audience? All right. Oh.
So there was a sort of implicit undertone in what you were saying, which is that capital investment, barring data centers where there's just sort of secular immediate demand, capital investment is on hold as a result of a lot of what's going on with the changing decision-making landscape in the federal government. I'm curious as to, when you talk to your clients, what is the mile marker they are looking for to say, okay, things are settled down now, I can make a decision?
Reauthorization. Everyone assumed up until now, up until the last year, that reauthorization was going to be a reauthorization of IIJA. It is very clearly not going to be that now. Graves has made that clear. Capito has made that clear. That is not what's going to occur. And so for them, it's like, okay, great, I've still got some of my IIJA funding. Some of it, maybe that's discretionary, is on pause. And so they're waiting to see. I didn't get it obligated before January 20th. I didn't get my grant agreement signed before January 20th. So there are specific projects that are on hold because of that. But I think in the medium and the longer term, it's what does reauthorization look like? And particularly for non-traditional surface transportation highway, basically highways and bridges, there's a lot of talk. So Graves, for example, is using a term from 20 plus years ago and is calling this the highways bill. We have not used that term for over 20 years to describe the surface transportation. And they're talking about less funding for the other modes, such as transit and other things. And so for our clients, it's like, well, if I'm suddenly going to have a lot less either formula funds or discretionary funds for two of my three modes over here, I got to figure out how to redistribute. So I'm going to put a hold on my traditional stuff, which I know I'm going to have for my highways and my bridges. I'm going to have funding for, but I don't know how much I'm going to have to beg, borrow, and steal from them to keep the other ones alive. And so I think that that's where, in theory, they know they have highway money, but it's how much are they going to lose on the other side of the ledger that is really hurting them. We're also hearing about the significant cuts to federal agencies and staffing. And we're hearing significant discussions about the transfer of responsibilities for certain things from federal highways, for example, to states, such as NEPA delegation. Right now, 9 states in the country have NEPA delegation authority, meaning that they can perform up to certain levels of NEPA clearances on their own. And they're self kind of certifying. They want to do that for all states, which is great. But if there's no funding that comes from that, with that, how are states going to staff that? If it's basically becomes an unfunded mandate. So those are the things that they're signals of this might happen in reauthorization, that states are having to say, I don't know that I can make any decision right now because I don't know what, a year and a half looks like in terms of what the funding for the next 5 years is. So that's, at least for us, I don't know what you guys are saying, but that reauthorization is the kind of source of the heartburn right now, and not knowing where that's going to go.
I would agree. I mean, just this understanding. They've faced uncertainty sort of like this before, but I think there's so many layers of it to identify sort of the appropriate path forward. I think is a challenge at this point. But yet they still have systems they have to manage, O&M. They have to, they still have they have issues that haven't gone away and continue to get bigger. So it's just trying to keep the systems moving as well, and keeping their with their own staffing challenges, at the state and local levels. So.
And you can.
Yeah, it's on a slightly smaller level. Worrying about the potential chance of being precluded from certain money that might come out because they're putting something in place, specifically potentially a technology in place, that all of a sudden you go from having this very high level guidance of AI implementation or this, and then all of a sudden a new smart formula or something similar grant comes out, and all of a sudden it's, well, you have to use this, this, and this. And it's, we just spent $2 million putting this system in place. There's some legitimate concerns that could then cause not only your inability to partner or work with others, but a straight up preclusion from certain funding. There's no clear on what that could be or what that could look like, but there's been indications that guidelines and specifics of what is going to be, what's your baseline, what do you have to have in place, or what do you need to report back on, or what data must you use or not use, could come out for some of this funding at some point. And there's definitely a hesitation that we want to move forward with this or that, but if we go the wrong direction and turn right and they needed us to turn left, then we actually take ourselves out of a potential bucket of money for some of this grant funding or something else. And a lot of times that is, then matched up to go on these project journeys for either pilots or full implementation. So we're trying to work through that, but that is definitely and there's not a clear date on when they're going to release a lot of those guidelines and what needs to be in place for that, but that's definitely something that we're trying to lead them up to that, but until we get that guidance, a lot of it is like, we're gonna hold on anything that goes completely in the deep end, tip of spear type stuff.
And I think I'm gonna take up moderator's privilege here, because I think my question is a good follow-up here, which is, the way I even wrote these questions, when we're thinking about P3s, we're often thinking about greenfield development and taking a project from the no or lost in the sands of time into the yes, we can get this built pile. But also an undercurrent to all of this and to the kind of the buck is due state of a lot of this infrastructure from 70, 80, 100 years ago, is that it's not necessarily greenfield, new roads, new lanes. It's now thinking about mandatory spending, that we're either going to, we might build a new rail line or we might not build a rail line, but we will just do a traditional procurement to the tune of infinity money if we don't get our head together about certain large-scale capital projects. So separating out, from the greenfield P3 from from the maintenance P3 or the redevelopments, is there a difference between how you're seeing both of those or where people are going?
I mean, certainly, I think even before this past year, folks have struggled to do new projects, right? To piece together. I mean, that's there's piecing together the state, local, federal funds and financing and all of the things that are needed for new projects. I think we've had a number of clients who have done that in the past several years and past decade plus, and they're still paying for it, right? They're still they still have kind of long-term obligations associated with big shiny new things, and it makes it harder, quite frankly, to make the argument for new shiny new things if you're still paying for assets that may not even be, fully completed yet, and going back to sort of the long time frame, it's kind of increasingly hard to have the public, show up with more funds for new things when they are just kind of struggling to keep the existing systems going. So we have definitely, and I think that goes back to the conversation we had earlier about kind of how are you leveraging existing assets, how are you squeezing more value out of existing assets that you may not necessarily have focused on before, and how are you using the tools that you have learned on these kind of new greenfields efforts to make the most of everything across your portfolio, and those are definitely conversations folks are focused on having, and particularly again folks who have gone through the big investments and now are not able to go back to the same people for the same money, or for the same amount of money as things you can get pricier and pricier as well for delivery.
I'd agree. I think we're seeing outside of the social infrastructure space, save K through 12. K through 12, we're still seeing that be a more renovation, existing asset upgrade. But other forms of social infrastructure, we're seeing full-on replacement, so more of the greenfield model, et cetera. Transportation, we're mostly seeing, again, upgrades to existing infrastructure. We're not seeing whole, new kind of let's build a new toll road, let's build a new asset, to your point, Jodie, of we've got enough assets we can't already maintain. We can't add new ones to the list that aren't sort of, reimagined old assets. So I think things like choice lanes are really interesting, and that is providing somewhat of a new type of asset alongside an old one, which is you're now giving people a choice. You can pay to maybe have slightly less traffic over here, or you can continue to use your general purpose lanes on this side. It's the same asset because sometimes they're just redistributing lanes, sometimes they're adding an extra lane from a shoulder, et cetera. So it's not really greenfield and new build, but they are creating a new sort of asset and upgrading the other along with it. And so that's where I think kind of thinking creatively about how we look at our assets and how they can be used in different ways in the future. I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Great. And we're pretty much up on time now. I think we're good to close out the panel, or if there's one last question. I think we're good. As Jonathan said this morning, we've solved it. Thank you all, and if you are a young professional or have young professionals in your infrastructure organization, please reach out to us at Young Professionals in Infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those are very good questions.
Okay, so we have a reception set up in the next room, so we can where we had lunch, so we can move over there and follow up with any questions to the panel or just to visit among ourselves. I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank again our sponsors, Transurban, I-66 Express Mobility Partners, Nossaman, Plenary, Nexco West, make it all possible for us to do this. So many thanks to our panel, many thanks to our sponsors, and many thanks to all of you for making it a great day. And look forward to chatting with some of you next door for those of you who have time to stay and visit. So thanks very much.